Hi guy, welcome to the AMIGArama podcast. I'm your host Lorfarius, and in this week's show we will be taking a look at Putty. But before we do, we need to take a look at this week's Amiga news. First up, this isn't really Amiga's news as per se. I'm really chuffed to have found over the last month several Amiga history books that I've had all sorts of problems actually tracking down. First up was the Bitmap Brothers History 1. Completely out of print, couldn't get it anywhere, and then saw it on eBay for like 40-50 quid and thought, oof, I'm going to have that, because the number of Bitmap Brothers games that I just can't cover because there's next to no information out there. It's quite surprising, especially seeing the size of this company and the effect they had on the Amiga at the time. It's very weird how it's all sort of been brushed under the carpet. Is that sort of like what Rare did or Ultimate back in the 80s where they refused to get like press interviews and stuff? I'm not entirely sure, though it seems very strange. I also managed to pick up the Sensible software book. Now, both of these came from read-only memory, and the Sensi one is still in print, but I was really glad to get this because there's a few games I've wanted to cover, but I've just not been able to. For one, Sensible Golf. Now, Rob Hazelby was mentioning on the Facebook group a couple of weeks ago how the putting system was just way beyond him, and I've got very vague memories of playing this as a kid because it was one of those Sensi games you had to get. You know, there was lots and lots of excitement for it, and I can remember buying a copy and taking it home and just being completely put off by it and going playing Swaz again. So I'm looking forward at some point going back to it and tackling it properly. I'm always on the lookout for stuff like this. It can be very hard to find interviews or decent articles about companies in the past and games that they've done. If you ever find anything you think I might be interested, feel free to drop me a line because it will help out with a future episode. Next up was something I just noticed on my random web browsing, but Crackerjack 2001, he's written a full guide to getting onto Telnet and bulletin board systems. Now that should be usable for the Amiga, but if you're like me and have, well, pretty much no clue whatsoever about any of this, you should be able to follow his steps through to using Telnet and just getting it set up in general. It's a pretty decent guide with lots of photos and it talks it through clearly in English. He's also a huge Amiga fan. You can tell from his desktop background because like me, it's covered in Amigas. I also see loads of BBSs posting to me on the Twitter feed, and there's this massive community out there that's very active and seems to be doing a hell of a lot. So if you want to get involved with that, click the link in the show notes and let me know how you get on. I was also browsing Old School Game Blog the other day when I noticed a few articles, stuff I've completely missed in the past. It does happen, I'm afraid to say. And I noticed that last year anyway, someone released this brand new disc magazine called Sceneworld. Now this was up to issue 28 and I went over to Pouet, which is POUET.net, just to have a look at what they had, and they've got the full 28 shows in one full link. I'll stick that into the show notes. I thought it was well worth looking at, especially with these old magazines, because I'm sure there's loads and loads of these out there which I just never hear about or never get a chance to use. Again, if you've heard about any of them, drop me a line and I'll have a look and mention them on the show. With the news out of the way, let's move over to this week's game. There are a lot of games on the Amiga that I just didn't play as a kid, but I was sort of aware of in the background, and I would dabble from time to time with the odd demo and stuff. And Putty was one of those games that I was always aware of, I always wanted to play, though I never really got much opportunity. I think a friend did have it at the time and he seemed to be quite taken by it, though strangely it didn't seem to be the sort of game I wanted to play. So I never really dabbled in any way, shape or form. Until recently, when I realised there was a copy of Putty Squad over on the Vita. Now, it wasn't a bad game, I had a fair bit of fun with it, and I thought, well, looking back at the Amiga version, because this was an original Amiga release, well, sorry, Amiga unreleased, because it never actually came out, it was redone later on, and I thought I'd dabble in it and try giving it a go, so we'll jump right in and see what I can come up with. Now, it was published by System 3, who did games like Myth, History in the Making, which we covered a very, very long time ago. That must have been episode 25. My god, that is a long time back. The Last Ninja Games, IK Plus, which is a very famous fighting one, I think. Limbo's Quest, Tusker, and a few other games. They also developed it too, so there's not much to bounce around with different games. Now, this one came out in 1992, and it's a single player game only. It's on 3 floppy disks, though it was re-released as Super Putty in 94 over on the CD32. Now, the first thing you think hearing that is, oh, it's going to have all sort of fancy extra features, though I don't think they did with this game, which is a bit of a shame. Looking over at the programmers on the game, there was at least 4 or 5 of them. It was quite a huge team, which did surprise me. You had Dan Phillips, Dave Collins, John Kemp, and Rob Stevens. Now, between them all, I didn't want to go through every single one because some of them didn't do many at all. You had Myth, all the Last Ninja games that came over, something called Fuzzball, I do like the name of that, Super Putty, that must have been the CD32 re-release, and Hostile Breed. I think that's an alien type game. Is that a public domain game? I'm not entirely sure. Now, graphics wise, we've got Joe Walker, who worked on Barbarian 2. Also worked on Sliders, Megalomania, Death Sword, and Axe of Rage. I'm not entirely sure. Oh, is that? I think that might be the original Barbarian, or maybe the German name of it or something. I'm not sure. Anyway, the next person on the graphics was Phil Thornton. He worked on Last Ninja 3. I do want to cover the Last Ninja games, though the reason I'm holding back is I'm not very good at them sort of isometric adventures, and to be honest, they really tend to annoy me. What an odd thing to say. I just can't get into the angle or the style of game, or even how you have to work around buildings and objects within them. It's a very odd distaste of them, so I tend not to go near them, but we will have to tackle them at some point, I promise, guys. Now, he also worked on Myth, as I said before, Fuzzball, Super Putty again. Next up was Robin Levi, who worked on Fuzzball, Last Ninja 3, Myth, oh, here's an interesting one, Rough and Tumble. It's not and, it's N, isn't it? And also Super Putty. The music was done by Phil Thornton, and he worked on the graphics, so that's quite a good mix. And also Richard Joseph. He's quite famous. He worked across all the Sensible software games, the Bitmap Brothers ones as well, so, you know, lots like the Chaos engines. Is it Cadaver as well, maybe? Rise of the Robots, oh, the poor guy. Putty as well, Street Racer, etc, etc. This guy was prolific across the Amiga, and he's done some of the best music on the system, so well worth looking into. Looking into the history, Phil Thornton came up with the initial game idea during a fever dream whilst suffering from the flu. Now, I hear that from a lot of creative people. That always reminds me of the Terminator film, wasn't it? James Cameron who comes up with that story. What is it we called? Anyway, he caught that whilst travelling over in India. I don't know, the only time I ever had any sort of a fever dream like that was when I was dreaming about a train about to run me over. That was a very odd... I can still remember that, and it's 20 odd years later. Then again, do you want to be dreaming about blue blobs attacking you and big robot armies? Who knows? When the game started out, the main character was just a piece of changeable elastic that later morphed into a ball of putty, which was much easier to create ideas for. And that moldability is the main focus of the game really, especially with all the different sort of forms and ways you can move around. Of course, using putty or moldable plastic, I don't know what and how it's supposed to be, needs a lot of animation, especially on the Amiga, and the software he used was something called Movie Setter. Now that created an original animation package demo. When Mark Cale of System 3 saw this, he was so impressed by it, he had Phil start working on a game straight away. The SNES and Amiga were chosen as the driving force to actually market the games for. No one had really seen anything like this before, and it must have piqued a lot of people's interest, and they used a 286 PC with something called PDS development software, which was used to create the game. Now they did approach Silly Putty for some sort of license, and they were quite into it at first. You're not sure what Silly Putty is, I don't know what you grew up as. It's basically this, it's like this squingy, squirty mass of elasticy rubber stuff. You can mould it into things, like roll it up into balls, stretch it out into sticks, and it sticks to things slightly as well. It's very gross stuff, but it was all the rage in the 90s. Even I had some of that stuff growing up. Does seem very odd to me that Silly Putty couldn't see the marketing opportunity with this. If you look at things like the Zool games with the swizzles, lollipops and stuff like that, the extras were always a big thing, and I'm sure they drove sales of sweets, and it would have drove, well, piles of Silly Putty to kids and things, because this does to some degree look like a kid's game. At one stage there was even going to be a Silly Putty Amiga cartridge. That does sound odd, but with a retail price of £60. They cancelled the idea as it was just too costly. That reminds me of things they used to do with like the Commodore 64, and was it the C64 GS, that weird con of a console? I don't know what else to say about that. That's the usual thing where companies get jealous of the likes of Nintendo and Sega and think, oh, we're going to conquer that market, and then rather than come up with something original and new, they would just stick their main computer budget version of it into a console and then try and market it as something new, on the off chance they'll be able to sell software which is usually up for about £5 or £10 for £35-40. It really was a huge market for them back in the day. It doesn't surprise me really that a fair few of them actually tried it. Having said that, it seemed there was also a C64 version well into development at the same time, but System 3 thought it just wasn't very good, and so they cancelled it. A few more tidbits about the game. Originally it was meant to be a flip screen platformer, but after playing around with the scrolling, which didn't affect the actual frame rate, they decided to switch over to the moving screens. Now the game itself has 1 megabyte of sound taken from Phil Thornton's Laserdisc collection. I am a huge fan of those, just as he was, as he had a massive collection of Tex Avery cartoons, and it seemed the perfect match for the game, so he pinched a few of them from there, probably rejigged them with Amiga music magic. It's also where a lot of the game gets its style from, that sort of crazy, over-the-top, big-eyed animation and body parts and the look of things. Very, very bizarre. It was in development for a total of 2 years. Now that is massive for a game, especially back then. It was also bundled along with the Commodore 600. Now I think this is actually where I first saw it or became aware of it, though I'm quite sure it wasn't in the bundle I had, though I'm not sure it was 20 odd years ago, 25 years ago, god I am old. Now there was a sequel called Putty Squad which came straight after. That of course was made for the Amiga. It never actually got released as the market was effectively falling apart at the time. This is CD32 era, so it would have been 94, 95. It sounds incredible, but the entire game was finished. It was complete, and then I think around 2013, 14, somehow a copy got out or someone heard reference to it still existing, and they got in touch with like the original guy behind it all, and they got chatting, and eventually they released it as a free download for the Amiga, and it also came out on the likes of the Vita, 360 and PS3. Now I hope you are all sitting comfortably as I dig into one of the most dramatic stories of Amiga gaming history. In a galaxy not too distant from here, there is a planet called Zid. Orbiting around this planet is a small moon called Putty Moon, which is home to the Putties and their flexible friends. Putty Moon is a peaceful and carefree place where a putty could ooze away the days or hang from the ceiling and drip. That is until one dark day when a sinister spaceship appears in the sky. On board was the evil wizard Dazzle Days and his thoroughly obnoxious sidekick Dweezil the cat. Life on Putty Moon would never be the same again. No sooner had the ship shape filled the sky than Dazzle Days and Dweezil's sinister plan began to unfold. The two evildoers were going to capture all the little chewy and totally non-crunchy putties, foil wrap them and ship them off to Earth as Super Gum, the one that blows the biggest bubbles and shrieks when it bursts. That does sound awesome. Watching on in terror, Billy Putty, aspiring local hero, desperately searched for the courage to help his friends. Boldly stepping out from his place of safety, he is surprised when confronted by a screaming baby, wondering just where had it come from. In between sobs, cries, whimpers and attempts to eat Billy, oh my god, the baby tells him that Dazzle Days has been kidnapping naughty babies from Earth and turning them into horrid and grotesque creatures. Billy could wait no longer. He must spring into action, or at least bounce, and bring down this evil tyrant that had consigned his family, friends and fellow putties to a fate far worse than death. Well, how would you like to be in someone's mouth? Chewed, bitten, squashed and pumped up with air till your head burst. But Billy's quest might not be a solo one, for one day he saw several flying saucers arrive from the planet Zid. The bots, mechanical inhabitants of Zid, friendly to the putties and were sure to help him. Dazzle Dave also noticed the arrival of the bots and fearing they would interfere with his wicked work, he set a trap for them. As the bots began to explore Putty Moon, Dweezil lay in wait for them. When they drew close, he froze them to the spot, then set them in blocks of ice. Dweezil was unable to freeze all of the bots, so Dazzle Dave set... Dazzle Dave? What am I going on about? Dazzle Days set some of his most evil and horrid creatures to harass and control them. Yes, I'm not quite sure what they've been drinking when they wrote this one. Now, for what is quite unique, especially for this sort of a game, the first level is actually set in a sort of tutorial or training gym. This gives you the chance to try out all of the different moves that Putty can actually do, rescue things like bots, learn how to tackle enemies, you know, the usual typical stuff. Not forgetting things like practicing jumps, moving and squelching about and punching things, something you all really well need to learn just to play the game, and it is a pretty good start for the adventure that's about to come. And in a way, I really appreciate this opening level because it can be quite difficult to learn some of the moves, and this gives you full opportunity to practice everything. And there's little like signposts in the background which point the way and tell you on and off how to do things, and you get a chance to play around with it properly. And straight away you'll see that it's not your typical platformer. Along the top of the main screen is a HUD which displays things like magic for the moves, pliability for health, number of lives, it's just free to start, you can get more as you go through the levels, the number of bots that you've either rescued or are still out in the world, plus your actual score. Now the stages actually scroll in time with you as you bounce and stretch around the screen. This is all a bit Stretch Armstrong style. Now, Putty is a small blue blob that can stretch and change shape, and he's roughly the size of Samus as a ball from Metroid. Unlike her though, he can't actually stand up tall, and you only grow bigger when actually exploding. We'll get to that later. The aim of the game is quite simple. You just have to rescue all of the bots and take them up to the exit. Now this is usually a UFO, sometimes it can be a door or an elevator effectively exiting the level. It all depends on which level that you're actually on. Of course, it's not that easy, and it consists of things like freeing them from ice blocks or up high and absorbing them into Putty. I don't know how else to describe that. It's really gross. And you can then carry them over to the exit. Now, at the same time, they can be dropped or collected at any point. It even happens, I think, when you get hit by an enemy. So a lot of the time it's safer when tackling traps or other baddies just to drop them in a corner somewhere and then go and tackle it whilst it's safe and then come back and pick it up again. I mean, just explaining it sounds insane, though it just works incredibly well. It's so very cartoony and over the top, but just the way that you move around the levels and the way the stretching and the picking the actual figures up, that just works really great. The controls for the game, they are an odd mix for sure. The training gym gives you some nice pointers to learn and all the moves, but there is a lot to take in. Putty doesn't actually walk, he wriggles around the screens, and there's like an odd delay when changing direction. Now that sounds odd, it's almost like there's some sort of momentum there and it's this odd little pause, and it does add a bit of weight to the character. Now Putty can stretch by pressing fire and holding a direction, and he goes out quite far, it's quite strange. And he will also bounce if you press up, and he will get a bit more height every time the longer you hold up. He can melt to absorb the bots, and I think that's just by pressing down, and then they sort of like sink into you as you come over them. Now you can only do this one at a time though, and it can also absorb enemies. He can also mould into other characters, which is very, very odd because he stays the same colour, and inflate to then explode, and that will take out a load of enemies in the immediate area. And finally, there's just a simple jab by tapping fire and a quick direction, and he will actually grow a fist out of the side of his body. That does actually look quite awesome. The levels are filled with lots and lots of power-ups, things like false teeth to beat larger enemies, pocket watch for extra time, nice and simple, instant up or down, now that allows you to move either to the top or the bottom of the stage, invulnerability, again nice and simple, bubble gum to make you inflate. I hope that's not other putties he's actually eating, I've just realised that, ooh that's gross, and of course he pops. And coffee, which distracts the actual bots. If you leave it somewhere, it stops them returning, I think, to the original point. For up to 30 seconds, there's also a trash can, which lets you carry up to 4 other bots rather than the standard one. Now, the levels, of course, are filled with lots and lots of different aliens or baddies, depending on your point of view. Now, these come from bouncing mushrooms, Terminator carrots, I don't know how else to describe them. It also called that in the manual, so you can probably imagine what they look like. Scouse, sausage, say no more, fried eggs, goblins, pigs on space hoppers, firework imps, teddy bears. I mean, what is it with games and teddy bears? I mean, Robocod was filled with them. Flying gits as well, Frankenstein's monster, and even train spotters. Yes, there's a good range of weird enemies in this game. Now, some of course can be bounced on, whilst others need a good jab to the gut. Some of the enemies will attack you or go for the bots before you can get to them. That often leaves you having to think faster to save them from some sticky situations. There are 6 levels to explore with 3 stages in total. You get things like the Putty Moon, Dazzle Days, Villas, Techno Fear, Oriental Rooms, it was the 90s, Toy Town, and the Twilight Zone. I mean, I'm not sure where some copyright wasn't involved here. Again, it was the 90s and a lot of places tended to get away with this stuff. It really does have some great cartoon-like graphics, and I can understand the Tex Avery references and style. It does look like something from a Warner Brothers animation. Now there's lots of bright colours, great detail, and packed stages with lots of things like traps and big death-defying leaps through the air. It's quite difficult to jump in this, you have to line it up, it's almost pixel perfect, and it does take some time to get across. Now all of the levels have their own unique look, of course, matches up to what I said with the names, and most importantly, everything is drawn to a really decent scale, and it's always fun to see what each stage is going to throw up in front of you. Besides the opening music on the actual title screen, which does get you all pumped up, I really like that tune, there's nothing else in the game, especially on the levels, beyond something I forgot to mention earlier. There is this Uncle Ted power-up who appears on screen for 30 seconds or so, and he makes the enemies dance, and there's this really rocking tune that comes on the screen. It really needs to be seen to be believed. Now, luckily the sound effects really do step in and do an amazing job at keeping the game entertaining, just like any cartoon should. Now, Putty makes all sorts of silly, stretchy, balloon-like noises, and even has a satisfying pop when he actually explodes, which is something you want in every game. Let's have a look at some of the game's problems. Now, first up, it can be really difficult to see Putty. With his blue colouring, he can often blend into the backgrounds, and I felt that it might have been better if he actually stood out more, maybe with something like a white or black outline, just to differentiate him from, like, some of the areas are actually blue, and you know, you've got this blue putty thing and he's just a round blob. It's very strange they didn't pick up on this or do something about it, because it does stand out quite early on when you start playing. I did say before that movement has this weird sort of slight delay, and it can take some time to actually get used to it. It does make it more of a puzzle platformer than a run in and bounce and jump. You know, it's not a Mario style game. It's very, very different to that sort of thing. There's also lots and lots of different moves, all from a single button press with a direction. Now, it makes it very easy to mess up something that you need to do. Let's say you need to jump and then jab and then absorb something quickly. Problem is, you need a lot of like pixel perfect movements, and there's not a lot of room for error there, so it's very easy to mix stuff up, especially in the heat of the moment when you're bouncing around trying to get through a section. And it does feel, sadly, a little bit overcomplicated, and when you play this on the CD32 edition, it's not anything different. They've not really expanded the controls in any way, shape or form, which is a shame. I have to comment on the difficulty. After the initial opening gym or tutorial, it really does seem to throw you in at the deep end, as the difficulty just seems to ramp right up. The lots of jumps between platforms are very, very tough, and the spikes and things in the enemies. It's quite a difficult game, and it will take you some time to get through it. I also need to bring up the lack of in-game music, which is a shame because Richard Joseph's involved in this, and that initial music track is fantastic. It made up a bit with those fantastic sound effects. I mean, they really are something else, but you would expect that the CD32 version, I mean, it's on a CD, that thing's packed to the rafters with space, and there's no like CD audio, unless it was just the versions I was playing with. I did check a couple of others online in case like the ones I had weren't working, and I couldn't find any in-game music anywhere beyond Ted. And of course, I need to mention that there is no sort of knockback when you get hit by enemies. The pliability rating just drains, so you have to be very careful you don't get stuck in one spot with an enemy walking backwards and forwards and draining your bar away, because you will die quite quickly. It's time to have a look at the magazine scores. Now, Amiga Format gave this 95%, CU Amiga gave it the same at 95%, Amiga Computing 92%, Amiga Power 90%, The One 87%, and finally Amiga Power with the lowest, I think, at 86%. Generally though, lots and lots of praise in the magazines, and the scores for the most part seem to be quite fair, but the controls for me just put me right off, I'm sad to say. Lots of sections felt too hard and a bit too fiddly to get through. This might be down to personal taste though. Again, an opinion is an opinion. You might like this, I just didn't get on with parts of it. Now, the number of simple jumps I felt I should have quite easily been able to make were often misses, and I would plunge to me death or plunge way to the bottom of the level, and it feels like it just throws you right in. It's very, very difficult, and I will say that I'm glad there's an energy bar. The fact that there's no knockback is a problem in itself though, because at times you really are bouncing and working your way through quickly, and there can be a lot of enemies coming at you at the same time. It can be quite tough. Thankfully, you will get used to the controls, but having up to jump with the same for the other moves, plus fire, it all feels a bit weird. It can make the platforming more difficult than it actually needs to be. The sound effects though are really something else. It really made me feel like I was watching a cartoon in action. I had loads of fun with it. It really does add to the sense of humour to the game. I just couldn't understand why there wasn't any sort of music within the game itself. It was very annoying and it did put me off a slight bit. It does have its flaws, but if you can see past them and not get too frustrated with the difficulty or the control method, then I will say that there's a lot to enjoy. For me, the whole game felt like it needed tightening up, and it just wasn't until I played the Vita sequel that I realised that they sort of fixed all of the issues that I had with the original. The movement, for one, there's none of that delay stuff. Putty just like moves left and right straight away. It feels right, it's fantastic. I believe though it's the same on the Amiga release that they actually did. I've not played that properly. I think we'll have to cover that at some point because it's quite an interesting thing to actually look at. Despite the flaws and my grumbles, I will say that I do feel like I will be returning for more, which is always a good sign. You know, they certainly got something right, and I keep chuckling over those sound effects and Uncle Ted making the other people dance. This is definitely one you need to see and play for yourself. And it's that time of the week where we bring the show to a close. As always, if you'd like to learn more about the show, you can pop along to AMIGArama.com, or if you'd like to get in touch, you can drop me a line over on the Facebook page, which is facebook.com/AmigaRama, over on the Twitter account, which is @AmigaRamaPod, or do it the old-fashioned way and drop me an email on Lorfarius@AmigaRama.com. I should also take a moment to ask for you guys to pop along to iTunes and drop the show a review. It helps to get the show discovered and for more people to pop along and join in the Amiga fun. And just before we sign off, we of course need to take a look at our Patreon supporters. As always, a huge thank you to these guys. They really do help the show each week with their donations. If you'd like to join in, you can do so over at patreon.com/AmigaRama. And they are Adam Bradley, Darren Coles, Graham Vebke, Glenn Milford, Jason Warnes, O'Brien's Retro and Vintage, Kremsky, Retro Ravi, Richard Legg, Sneff and Treble. Thanks for listening, and until next time, guys.